Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to discuss the flowering and explosion of culture and social movements that emerged in the aftermath of World War I. Last time we talked about sort of the unpleasant friction that was created by the end of the war. And so today we're going to look at some of the opportunities and some of the new cultural movements that emerged out of the sort of blending of cultures that happened with the great migration and social change that the war created. So here are your objectives for today. So Harlem Renaissance and New Woman movement. So let's dive in and talk through it. The Harlem Renaissance is a creation of African American culture and identity that really started to emerge in cities in the North and sort of Upper South areas. Within these Black enclaves, I mean, it's sort of associated, the Harlem piece is associated with Harlem, New York, from a Claude McKay book, but it also showed up in a lot of other places within these Black enclaves where you get these groups of African Americans who are banding together, building sort of a cohesive social culture and developing new artistic expressions that we're going to be talking about today. These Black communities, especially, of course, Harlem in New York, which you could see sort of out on this map, really created a flourishing and an atmosphere to create African American and Black culture. For the first time ever, we really get Black neighborhoods electing Black representatives, opening up Black businesses, and catering to the African Americans within these communities. And so, despite the fact that African Americans have had the right to vote, going all the way back to the end of Reconstruction, for the first time ever, we're really seeing the growth of Black political power and the first Northern African American representatives elected to Congress. And so this is going to mean that African Americans are now a larger part of the political constituency, and they're going to be a group that different political parties are now going to have to start catering to and addressing. And you're going to see them become important parts of various political coalitions here going forward. And so for the first time since Reconstruction, we really see a rising of Black political power in the United States, which of course is really important as far as getting your ideas addressed and pushing towards, getting political representation and recognition. Langston Hughes becomes one of the voices of this, so take a moment and pause and read about his opinions about this movement. So pause and take this in. But a lot of this is really about creating Black identity and Black sort of cultural movements. One of the most important cultural movements out of this is sort of your jazz and blues movement. It's combining together sort of traditional African American and African musical styles with new developments that had happened during this time period. And so it's and jazz and blues music are a combination of syncopation and improvisation that allow for individual artist expression in a very new, different way than sort of traditional folk music and traditional music patterns. As far as people you should be aware of, Duke Ellington, as far as popularizing the big band movement. Louis Armstrong is a virtuoso as far as improvisation in this movement. And you should probably know Bessie Smith because she's one of the artists who began to make this a crossover movement, popularizing jazz and blues music for both Black and white audiences. Although this originally started in a variety of different cities, again, Harlem is the place where it's often sort of associated with, especially with the Apollo Theater. And this movement is, of course, going to spread across the country and get adapted in a whole bunch of different ways. We're also seeing the birth of literature during this time period. We already mentioned Langston Hughes as a poet who is going to become incredibly influential and part of the voice of sort of the Black experience during this time period. The Jamaican-born Claude McKay gave the name to this movement with his book Home to Harlem, and we'll talk a little bit more about Claude McKay in a moment. And you should probably know Zora Neale Hurston writing stories in which Black people were centered. And so one of the purposes of this is to, again, tell the story of African Americans and to really center Black characters as complicated, protagonists exploring the various facets of their lives in a way that we really hadn't seen before, at least since, Reconstruction. Here's Langston Hughes' famous I Too Sing America. So take a moment, pause, take it in. Make sure you see how it sort of centers this idea of Blackness and progress. And artistic movements do the same thing. You see Black artists experimenting with expressionism, with cubism, with some of these more modern movements, again, focusing on the experiences of Black people as they go about their daily lives. Sort of again, rather than having them be peripheral or ancillary characters, sort of centering the artistic movement on their experience. Along with this, we also get the growth of Black nationalism. Although this is kind of a peripheral movement during this time period, you should definitely know Marcus Garvey, who's another sort of Jamaican born activist. Although activist, I don't know, is an interesting word to describe Marcus Garvey. He's a spectacularly charismatic and problematic individual in some ways. But what you guys need to know about him is he's pushing this idea of sort of Pan-Africanism before we really got Pan-Africanism with the Universal Negro Improvement Association, trying to connect together the experiences of Black people around the globe and trying to push for the improvements of all Black people. He was famous for his Back to Africa movement, which he really struggled to get people on board with for what I hope are obvious reasons. I mean, we've seen Back to Africa movements before, and generally the experience of Black people, of African Americans in the United States, is that the United States is their home and they're Americans. They don't necessarily want to head back to Africa or to have their fate linked to the fate of African people. Garvey, of course, also pioneered Black businesses, famously starting a cruise or a shipping line that he ran, and that eventually was involved in a lot of spectacular corruption. And so, again, Garvey, he's a complicated guy, and here's his manifesto. So pause, take a moment, read it, and then we'll move forward. And so Garvey, I don't really know how to categorize him, and I'm not doing a very good job of it right now. So if you're interested in Garvey, go dive into him. He's incredibly complicated and deep, so take your time and explore his experience. Part of this whole movement, in addition to just exploring culture, is to push for activism. W.E.B. Du Bois is much older and grayer at this point. He was pretty bitter, as we mentioned before, in the aftermath of World War I, that Black people didn't get more civil rights. He's still going to be the editor of The Crisis, at least for the time being, the sort of NAACP newsletter, and he's still trying to build this sense of Black history and Black identity. Although he's definitely going to get to the point where he gets fed up with all this and just emigrates to Ghana to promote Pan-Africanism there. The younger generation, people like A. Philip Randolph, who we talked about getting charged under the Espionage Act, is going to start Black labor associations. He's going to be responsible for the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and he's going to use this organization to attempt to push the political and economic interests of Black people and to further organize sort of this Black movement to push for better, again, economic conditions and the breaking down of economic and racial barriers. And we're going to see magazines directly targeting Black people. Although The Messenger was relatively short-lived, it did provide a forum for Black Americans to be able to express their opinions and to see themselves sort of mirrored in popular media. And so all of that is important to develop this sense of what it is to be African American and to create this type of sort of cohesive culture that's going to be really important going forward. Langston Hughes is going to eulogize the passing of Booker T. Washington here with the Ballad of Booker T. And so I put this in here mostly because I just think it's a really neat poem and because it, again, emphasizes some of the divide between the sort of gradualism of some Black advocates versus the immediacy of others. So you should definitely read the Ballad of Booker T, and then we'll move on. We also see increasing Black radicalism during this time period. Claude McKay is going to experience pretty brutal discrimination and is going to argue for potentially using violence to push back against Jim Crow and against oppression. And so he is going to, over time, push more and more extreme measures. And so we're always going to see this movement on sort of the fringes of the African American movement for civil rights. And A. Philip Randolph is going to become increasingly enamored with socialism as he fails to sort of make progress by pushing sort of traditional forms of economic activism. And Langston Hughes is going to famously travel to the Soviet Union in order to view this sort of communist vision of racial equality. And although he gets a very sanitized vision of Stalin's Soviet Union, again, there's this connection between sort of the movement for Black progress to other social and economic movements that's really important to understand sort of the things that Black people were talking about during this time period. We're also going to see a changing of women's roles and gender roles during this time period. As we talked about before, during wartime, as women step out of the traditional domestic sphere and take on new roles, we see pushes for greater rights. And so we talked, of course, about the women's rights movement and the suffrage movement. After war, we're going to see some drawback of that, as many women do return to the domestic sphere. But as always, not all women return to the domestic sphere. And after World War I, a lot of the especially working class women who moved out and got jobs are going to keep getting jobs. There's going to be pushes for equal pay during this time period. And although they're really not going to go anywhere substantial, it's important to lay the groundwork for some of the movements that are going to be happening here in the future. We also get this sense that women really are breaking out of the traditional cult of domesticity during this time period. This is the famous Now We Can Begin manifesto. So pause, read, and then we'll move forward. One of the things that really changes this for women is the greater acceptance of birth control during this time period. And so greater education about birth control and more striking down of laws limiting birth control and greater access to birth control is happening during this time period. And this allows family planning to occur and for women to control more of their economic and social opportunities. Because as always, women are taking on a larger role of sort of the domestic and childcare work. And if you have fewer kids, it frees you up to do more stuff. Whereas if you're constantly raising children, that becomes sort of an all-consuming part of your identity that doesn't leave a lot of room for other things. We get the woman most responsible for this is Margaret Sanger, who was the founder of a movement called Planned Parenthood, which is, again, problematic, especially in its founding. Unfortunately, Margaret Sanger and Planned Parenthood are going to get involved in the eugenics movement, which was very popular during this time period, trying to sell birth control for very, racist and social Darwinistic reasons. But at the same time, they're also going to provide access to birth control for other people who are not using it for racist reasons. And it's going to give women more control over their lives and more ability to participate in the public sphere. Here's Margaret Sanger giving a speech on birth control. So take a moment, pause, take it in, and then we'll move on. So regardless of how you feel about Planned Parenthood today, obviously this is a movement that is going to profoundly change the roles and opportunities women have within society. We're also going to see the breaking down of social spheres, as for certain groups of women, it becomes much more acceptable to go out. This is what's known as the flapper movement. During this time period in the 1920s, women are going to go to college in larger numbers. They're going to go out together without male escorts in larger numbers. During the war, in order to save fabric, dresses became shorter. We got the arrival or the popularization of sleeveless dresses and things like that. And after the war, this becomes more of a sartorial fashion choice as opposed to a wartime necessity. And so women are going to wear shorter dresses. They're going to show more ankle and in some circumstances knees. They're going to have shorter haircuts, wear hats, go out, drink, dance, and do a lot of the other things that were predominantly sort of male-occupied spheres. And there's going to be some pushback from this, but in general, women are going to become much more accepted in these places, and it's going to open up more opportunities for women moving forward. So that's the social changes happening in the aftermath of this. All of this is, of course, going to create a moral panic and a conservative backlash, but that's a story for tomorrow. So for today, we'll leave you there, and thank you for listening.